This is Castle 1. Race officer speaking.
Lane line is on boundary up ahead, 35 seconds out.
A bit lower and faster here.
That's a good one, Jimmy.
Still gaining on the lane line there.
We're looking at 10-5, 42. Matching him on the boundary, yeah. Copy.
Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome back to part 2 of our chat with Australian sailing legend, John Bertrand. Many of you may already know John's story, but if you haven't yet listened to part 1, head back there first. It's a great insight into the build-up to what we're about to hear, which is John's account of one of the most important sailboat races in the history of sailboat racing. In fact, if you're listening to this podcast off the back of the end of season 3, you'll have just listened to American Tom Whiddon talking about this cup from the other side of the fence. In that chat, Tom uses the phrase race of the century, which is exactly what it was, the biggest yacht race the world had ever seen. Before we pick things up with John, if you're enjoying season 4 of the podcast, then do head over and show your support at buymeacoffee.com/sailing podcast. It's easy to use, and your help allows us to stay ad-free and to keep on delivering these uninterrupted stories. So a huge thanks for the coffees. It makes a real difference. As I stand here recording this edition, it's impossible not to feel a slight sense of history. As we mentioned in episode 1 and in many previous episodes about the Cup, the New York Yacht Club had held onto the trophy for 132 years. Winning it was almost impossible. But time after time, challengers would head over to Newport to take on the Americans and lose. But as I say these words, exactly 39 years ago to the day, John Bertrand and his crew on board Australia 2 would be preparing for the biggest day of their sailing lives. The race of the century, the only ever sudden death 7th race in the then history of the America's Cup. We join our chat with John contemplating the upcoming battle as we briefly discuss the design risks associated with Ben Lixon's forward-thinking Australia 2.
There was no project ever as well prepared as that Australia 2 project. The dream was for us to win the America's Cup, and when we crossed the finishing line, the boat would implode into a million pieces. We got rid of all television sets, we got rid of all newspapers into the compound.
It's a constant cup design conundrum. How far do you go with innovation before it becomes a bit of a folly? Yeah. At the time, did you worry about that you'd be straying too far from the realms of sensible?
Well, we had the fallback that we had option for Challenge 12, and we could take that. And interesting enough, with all the work that we did over in Fremantle and then ultimately in Melbourne on Port Phillip Bay, it was still unclear which boat was superior between a Challenge 12 and Australia 2. But we made the pre-startability of Australia 2 was such that said, let's do that, that's our boat. And the other syndicate was owned then by a guy called Dick Pratt from Melbourne, and John Savage was the skipper of that boat. And when we went across to the US, we were very well organised relative to any previous America's Cup challenge, very tight. Compatibility of the team. Our team lived together for a couple of months together in one house to test the compatibility. We had to let a couple of people go because they didn't brush their teeth properly or whatever, all these idiosyncrasies, because we knew we were off to war, to America, hail, foul or well met, but the bottom line is, we're us against the world. Again, that's the way we saw it. Created the boxing kangaroo flag and men at work, our battle flag, our battle hymn, it's a different type of mentality. And as a result of a lot of experience that brought us to that point, but we're still slow downwind, got hammered by the Italians. And some very creative work by Schnackenberg and Huey Trahan created new spinnaker designs, smaller chutes, quite a lot smaller in the girths, and that brought us to life. In addition to that, Schnacks created a new mainsail, which brought us to life in light medium air, which was a little bit like a starboat sail. Beautiful twist up high. First time we were able to get the sail to twist instead of being open in the middle. And that brought that boat to life.
Tom Schnackenberg, another genius. It's interesting that nothing really changes in the Cup, because even now when we commentate on the America's Cup, it's about incremental changes every day, and it was the same then, obviously. And John, I'm going to ask you if you were ready. Did you feel ready? Did you have any doubts that you were the right guy to lead this band of brothers into battle against Dennis Conner and the machine of the US?
I had a lot of doubts, no question about it, because again, it had never been done before. And you, as you well know, even with the best intent and the best preparation, in the sport of sailing, you do not know, you cannot say, I'm going to win this thing. You have all the facilities and all the intent, but the fact is wind, water, all these things change in the sport of sailing. And the fact that this had never been done before, and there were a lot of reasons why, because the Americans were damn good at organisation and playing the game. But there was no project ever as well prepared as that Australia 2 project at that time in the history of the America's Cup. There's no question. And the team we had on the boat. Grant Simmer, who went on 11 America's Cups since then. I think the youngest tactical navigator ever in the history of Cup sailing. Young engineer, Australian lightweight Sharpie champion like myself. We had, Huey Trahan, huge amount of experience. Before that, Peter Gilmore was a tactician. He decided the team environment was too large for him, and he went on to endeavour to compete at the Olympics. So anyway, Huey came on. It was a better choice for us, more natural, more mature person. Was good. Colin Beashall, never wear shoes, most naturally gifted sailor you could ever come across. World starboat champions, silver medal at the Olympics in Atlanta, So we had some really interesting characters. We didn't have Olympic gold medalists on the boat. I was, at that stage, with my bronze, I was the most, credited, whereas Dennis had, Olympians all the way through. But we had a really tight team with huge trust and respect within the organisation that was hard for us to be killed off in the process. And we had a boat technically which was very good and being upgraded all the time as we knew more and more about, the machine that we had.
There was much controversy and litigation around your famous keel. How much did that rattle the New York Yacht Club? Tell us what they tried to do, and do you think DC was at all rattled?
Well, the fact that we had the audacity to keep the boat covered, never been done before when you look back on it. And so they didn't know what they were racing against, which was of great concern to Dennis and Halsey Herreshoff and Tommy Whidden and so on, and rightfully so, because our win-loss ratio was very good against the other challengers. I think we won 48 of the 55 races over the summer, and we did a lot of racing. And we did a lot of full-size America's Cup courses, unlike the Americans. And that was one of the reasons that we're able to develop our spinnakers, because we're being kicked in the arse by these conventional boats downwind. And bottom line is that I think really, when we're coming in terms of the response and the time, this whole program really did come together with incremental changes on the 11th hour. And interesting enough, we won the America's Cup downwind against Liberty and Dennis and the team, and they were running with, I think looking back on it, they were slow against any of the challengers downwind, not just us. And part of it was they used very short courses, multiple races every day, and they never figured out that there could be a problem downhill. Our long legs downhill, it just showed up if there was a problem with any of these, the sails, for example.
The New York Yacht Club weren't happy, though, were they? I mean, they did some extraordinary things.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
And people forget, or history forgets, that the Peter de Savary had generated a press conference where he showed the keel that they actually had, which was accepted by World Sailing, IYRU, I think it was called in those days, which was a wing keel. They never, and a guy called Howlett, I think it's Ian Howlett.
Ian Howlett, yes.
Yeah, a designer. He came up with this concept at the university, Southampton University, and it was never actually implemented, but that was okayed by the IYRU at the time. And that really burst the balloon of the New York Yacht Club. But they tried everything, including trying to get an affidavit from the chief technician at the ship model testing facility in Holland, that they in turn were the designers, not Ben Lexon, and so on and so forth. That was even days up to, and would you believe, like 2 days before the first race of the America's Cup, Alan Bond and Warren Jones had a meeting with the New York Yacht Club Defence Committee, led by McCullough. And I can't actually describe the words that Alan used, but it became clear that the New York Yacht Club were working with a crazy man, that he would expose the New York Yacht Club to the world, and it'd be a total embarrassment to the New York Yacht Club if they went forward. And using classic Australian blue words to carry the day. So the New York Yacht Club became clear to them that Alan wasn't going to back down. All these backstories is just amazing, and so we went to battle.
Okay, John, let's get into the America's Cup racing. What was the atmosphere like? Describe it, day one.
Well, you can't, and I told the guys, having been involved in 3 previous America's Cups, and some of them had already been involved, of course, Chick Longley and so on, Skippy, you can't practice the environment, regardless of the best intent. You can visualize it, but you can't practice it to the real world. So first day of the America's Cup, at the dock, you couldn't really communicate more than a metre in front of you. That was the sound of helicopters above and fixed-wing airplanes above that. So there was a swarm of helicopters above us. But I will tell you the backstory here, and is that we had our Prime Minister of the day, Bob Hawke, was in Newport. He and Paul Keating, who were the new government of the day, were in Washington, D.C. for an international monetary conference, and they came down for the first race. So the boat left at 9 a.m. plus or minus 30 seconds. It was a military operation. And at that stage, as we left the dock, the boxing kangaroo flag would be broken out, which is our battle flag, red gloves for aggression, pumped up chest for the pride of a nation. When you study armies over the last 1,000 years, we typically go to war with symbols, music and flags. So we create our own battle flag, which is now synonymous with winning in Australia. The Australian Olympic program, our official flag for all Olympic sports, is the boxing kangaroo flag. How cool is that? It's just fantastic. It makes us so proud. And our battle hymn was Men at Work Down Under, which is just it became a gold hit in Australia. So just before we are about to leave, Prime Minister Bob Hawke came down to the boat, and I was on the stern of the boat, and I said words to the effect of, welcome, Mr. Hawke, realising that we didn't have much time to talk. And he said, John, he says, call me Bob. It's typical of this man. And he said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, Bob, we'll give it our best shot. He says, bullshit. He says, destroy the bastards. So that was the Prime Minister of our country, So we went to war on day one. And I remember trying to talk to Huey, and it was, you couldn't, this is the noise, it was just deafening. And, this Australia 2 project was towed out, as was Liberty, and we went out day one.
And then you have to race.
Yeah.
I mean, that first race, from memory, it started well, but what happened next?
Is that the mainsail falling down?
No, the steering, the broken steering.
Okay, so we're neck and neck going down the bottom mark. And it was one of these experience factors. We have quite a lot of breeze. We had probably quite a lot, 12 knots or so, 13. Dennis was inside, not overlapped at that stage. We were a beam, but we weren't close to the leeward mark at that stage. And I made the decision to actually shy up and go over his stern, okay, jibe onto port. And as we did that, then the keel, the rudder system let go underneath the deck, and we lost steerage totally. So the weldings pulled apart. Part of the deal with Ben was it's all about power to weight ratio. He loved F1. I'll give you an idea. Benny's dream was to design an F1 car for Ferrari, no one else, where the fuel tank was designed just big enough such that when you cross the finishing line, the 12-cylinder, 1,000 horsepower engine would be sucking on vapor fuel. This is perfection in Benny's mind, right? This is the man we had to deal with. In addition to that, the fuselage would fall off. The carbon fibre was just strong enough to hang in there, and then the whole thing would, because of fatigue. And the driver was unconscious. Why? He was just given enough water to keep him going for 55 laps, and then he was totally dehydrated. So this was his world. So for Benny, the dream was for us to win the America's Cup. And when we crossed the finishing line, the boat would implode into a million pieces. Okay, that was perfection. So when you looked at Australia 2, it was not tacked together. It was built beautifully, but the bottom line is everything was really light. And it was about power to weight ratio. You take out an ounce here, then you particularly up high. And so there were facilities underneath all the steering gear. When we looked at it, we had to strengthen the whole thing. It wasn't battle ready at this stage. And so what was the reason there? Not a good enough maintenance program. It's a management issue. It wasn't bad luck. The management program, maintenance in particular, wasn't strong enough.
So a difficult first day, a disappointing first day. Race 2, more gear failure, as you say, a problem with the mainsail. Now 2-0 down, and then you traded wins. 3-1 down, match point. How tough was that? What do you remember saying to everyone that day? You're 3-1 down, it's match point.
Well, it's one of these things where, backs to the wall, and you've been there, and, and many, many people on this podcast will have been there. And this whole question of, okay, focusing on the outcome compared to the process. We talk about process all the time. And from my perspective, it was this whole issue of if we not survive, if we just do our job, we'll be invited back tomorrow. Very simple. And I remember saying to the boys, picture yourself on the back of an eagle, 1,000 feet in the air. And we look down and we see our little boat, Australia 2, sailing through the water, and we see a bow wave and a stern wave. And everyone on this podcast, I'm sure, has been on the back of an eagle. So anyway, we're on the back of this eagle, and we have some big scissors, and we fly down and we cut off the bow waves and we cut off the stern waves, and we release our boat for its full potential. And in my zany manner, I remember talking to the team about that let's release the beast and let us flow with the potential that we really have. And let's go out and just do our thing.
Did you say that to a boat full of Aussie sailors?
Yes, I did. Yeah. On the boat going out. Yeah, let's release this machine. Let's cut off the bow wave and the stern wave. And then I've actually went further and I said, the only people who are interested in the bow wave and the stern wave are the journalists who know nothing. Otherwise, they'd be on the boat. So forget about all the stuff. In fact, we got rid of all television sets. We got rid of all newspapers into the compound. And we just went into our bubble. The only person that could get through to me on the telephone was my mum in Australia, God bless her, and a mentor, a guy called Billy Osborne. Other than that, I had no contact with the outside world, nor did the rest of the team.
John, all of that's easy to say, isn't it? But fundamentally, the next race was crucial. You had to stop the rot, crush their momentum. How much responsibility did you feel?
I felt, it's interesting, I felt empowered by the organisation, by the team. Alan, Jim Hardy, because he'd been there, done it all, he was there, he was fantastic. I felt empowered by Grant and Bisho and all these characters. We're in this thing together. So did I, as skipper of the boat? Yes, of course. But this thing was really tight organisation. And we had the culture and we had the trust in the organisation such that it was very, very interesting. We were empowered from within.
You win that race. Now it's 3-2, still match point. Talk to me about race 6. Reading the reports, it seemed like you were all in tune, sailed the shifts perfectly, perhaps had an element of belief by then. Yeah.
And that was actually it was a turning point. I can still see it's a long time ago, but I remember Dennis and the team, I think they tacked away on trying to take another shift, and it was the wrong thing. We could see it. They'd made a mistake as they were attacking relative to what we thought was the game. It was actually quite tricky. A lot of the breeze was coming more offshore. And I felt a chink in their armour, most interesting, for the first time, in terms of their confidence within their decision-making ability. And we actually hit the shifts to the point where it became crazy, where the rich got richer. And it was one of those things where the air evaporated from behind relative to what we were sailing in, and we just got further and further in front. I remember competing in the 76 Olympics, one of the races I won in the Finn, and it just all came together again. There was just this, without even having to feel, it was this sense, this intuitive feeling of the next wind shift. And that's how we felt, and that's how I felt on that particular day. It was an intuitive decision-making where it was all flowing. Everything was slow motion.
Sometimes it just happens. And other times you battle it all the way. Well, John, at 3-all, you called a lady, and the next day recruited the help of Ireland's Harold Cudmore, a neighbour of mine. I'm very fond of him. Why do that? Why not just keep the momentum going?
Because my confidence was lacking in terms of pre-start. My time on distance was off, okay, and I needed more. I needed more practice, And so we got Harold in, and he was terrific. He'd basically take no prisoners, nothing to lose, and we had some really good, intensive pre-match, pre-start practice, and that was great for me. So with all the the racing I had done, the actual pre-start with Harold was by far the most intense that we're able to conjure up, and that was a great benefit for me to get back into a sense of rhythm in terms of pre-start.
It's impressive when a leader puts his hand up and says, I need a bit of help.
Yeah, but I felt confident, interesting enough with the team around me. Again, I didn't feel that... Again, there's this whole issue of, it was a 1 + 1 = 3 environment. Very similar to military, SAS or Navy SEALs, or we have SAS or commandos in Australia, and they talk about that all the time, where people just come together, where you are joined at the hip, and we felt that way. So did I feel exposed in terms of putting my hand up, saying I'm vulnerable? I did not, no. They call it the race of the century, and I think it probably is, yeah. The full significance really only became apparent when we got home. The most memorable events in modern Australian history: John F. Kennedy's assassination, Armstrong on the moon, and Australia 2 crossing the finishing line.
On the 26th of September, you headed out at 3-all, the longest winning streak in sporting history, 132 years, and this was the closest anyone had come. The final race of the 1983 Cup, and it was a real nail-biter. How much pressure did you feel going into that race?
Well, that was a lot. Yeah, that was a lot. We had a sense of what was happening in Australia, although we could only, in hindsight, visualise only a small percentage of really what was happening, where the country stopped. But it was one of those things where once we got going, and again, you know, this beautiful communication between myself and Huey and Grant, Bisho and Yarup and, you know, Damien on the bow and all that sort of thing, and Chink, it came together to the point where, again, it was slow motion, you know, where you say, okay, how do we click into this world where you really become very, very efficient in the way an organisation can operate. And as it turns out, you know, the leads changed, I think, 6 or 7 times. So it was, the boats were very, very similar in speed. Dennis and his team had found a loophole in the rule, and good luck to them, where they reduced weight in the boat and added sail area depending on the wind forecast. And they successfully did that. So the boat, you know, was really nothing upwind at all. Downwind, we were faster, but at one stage we were way out of it. You know, we're 47 seconds behind or something. We could hardly read their sail numbers. Winds were very tricky, you know, and at one stage, well, as I say, the lead changed so many times, but they were able to get a couple of left shifts and extra pressure, and they were sort of gone. So it was, you might say, heart in the mouth race, that's for sure. They call it the race of the century, and I think it probably is, yeah.
You were behind, but then you got ahead. Leading, covering Liberty, an intense tacking duel followed. Dummy tacks were thrown. How intense was it becoming on the boat? What was it like?
It was one of those things where we were, this was well, of course, an opportunity of a lifetime, no question about it. But it was like a hit squad. It was so well, you know, our organisation was so well practiced that hardly anything had to be said. Yeah, very, very. The leg where we actually came from behind and past them, when we looked at the computer printouts, it was as close to optimum that we'd ever sailed the boat. So, you know, at one stage, when we first got past on that particular, the 5th leg with the spinnakers, Kenny Judge, who was the trimmer, he didn't realise we were in front until probably 30 or 40 seconds after we'd passed them, where it became clear. So he was so locked into, you know, the trimming and whatever, and also that final leg, obviously lots of tacks, lots of covering, plenty of, but it was like a hit squad. It was like a military operation. Yeah.
You saved the best for last. It all came together. John, you crossed the line in the end, 41 seconds ahead. Just take a moment. Describe that for us. What was said amongst this exceptional team?
Well, first of all, I remember the smoke coming out of the gun. Don't remember the sound at all. I remember the York Yacht Club committee members with their boater hats. Let me just wind back. So one of the funny things in Newport is that we'd occasionally go down Main Street and, you know, I'd say to Benny, "Good morning, Benny," as if I'm swatting flies in Australia. Well, of course, there's no flies in Newport. They eradicated those a century ago, right? It's not acceptable. And so the Australian salute was this swatting thing, okay? Hand from one side to the other as if you're swatting flies. And the Americans picked up on that, and they thought that we're going, perhaps the pressure was such that it was a nervous inflection, okay? As we had heard later. When we crossed the finishing line, there were these dudes up on the deck of Black Knight with their boater hats on, and as we crossed the line, in unison, as they were literally impersonating swatting flies, they called out, "Well done, gentlemen." In unison, swatting the flies, the Australian salute, okay? But for us, crossing that line, it was a relief. We could go home. And of course, then the excitement and, you know, the outpouring of emotion but it was really, it didn't the full significance really only became apparent when we got home, and still is. You know, the number of people still literally come up in the street, even though it's, 40 odd years ago, if they're old enough, to come up to say not what I was doing, but what they were doing when we crossed the line. The country stopped. Apparently, we ran out of green and gold ribbon. You could not buy a bottle of champagne in Australia a day after the America's Cup. So the celebrations, I'm told, we were halfway around the world in Newport, but the celebrations, I'm told, were similar to the end of World War II for one yacht race. It's extraordinary. But it wasn't that. It was Australia taking on the world, and it was Everest here.
And everyone taking on the Americans.
Exactly.
You were racing for everyone. John, let's talk about the opposition. How did Dennis take it? Can you imagine being Dennis Conner at that moment?
Well, Dennis, we've never really talked about the America's Cup, Dennis and I, and we've raced against each other quite a lot in Etchell since, but rivers run deep. And of course he came back and won in 87, so he redeemed himself. But one thing I have said to Dennis in the past is, mate, you owe me everything. I made you famous. Otherwise, up until then, nobody cared. In America, that is. So he was able to come back and redeem himself in Fremantle. But yeah, so there's our mutual respect, obviously, between us two. But Dennis, he missed the handing over ceremony. Apparently, he was told the wrong date. So he was back in San Diego at the time, and the New York Yacht Club Commodore flew to Paris on business. So it was the Vice Commodore that presented, a guy called Bob Stone. I'll tell you the story. Your listeners will love this. So Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America. He was the man in 1963, when the President of the United States was assassinated. CBS, he took his glasses off and was seen to be a tear in his eye, and he says, "My fellow Americans, our president is dead." So this is Cronkite, Walter Cronkite. He came to Australia, and his two loves of sport was Davis Cup tennis and America's Cup. So he came out, and Australia won the Davis Cup that year, and he came out to see the trophy, and we took him to a barbecue with the team and so on. It was great. So so Walter told us the following story, that the night before the final race of the America's Cup, that seventh race, Commodore McCullough asked Walter into the New York Yacht Club to get his advice on the following. If those people win tomorrow, couldn't even say Australians, if those people win tomorrow, what do you think about the following scenario? We have a very good amateur photographer in the basement that can produce the video of the handing over ceremony in the model room of the America's Cup. Of course, we can't invite the press in because they're not members, and so we can. However, this fellow can reproduce enough copies to distribute out in the main street. What do you think about that? And Mr. Cronkite, who was then his claim to fame, God bless him, said that he was the chairman of the library committee of the New York Yacht Club. So here he was, had just interviewed the Cuban, prime minister, and got all these different people. So he was the man of the world. It's funny, isn't it? So he was the president of the chairman of the library committee of the New York Yacht Club. So that's why he was invited for advice. So Walter said to Commodore McCullough, he said, "Sir, if we do this, we'll be the laughing stock of the world, because at that stage, the America's Cup will be owned by the world, not by us." So eventually they took it down to the Marble House and presented it. And the first part of the presentation, the guy called Bob Stone, Rear Commodore Stone, he presented a hubcap to Benny, because Ben Lexon said that if we ever win that bastard, that trophy, I'm going to get a steamroller and flatten it. So he presented a hubcap to Benny before the America's Cup was presented to us. It was just fantastic. And it was just beautiful. They did it in great style. But it was a big deal in Australia, and still is. It's considered one of the great not sporting moments. They did a survey recently, the most memorable events in modern Australian history. John F. Kennedy's assassination, Armstrong on the moon, and Australia 2 crossing the finishing line.
It's crazy, isn't it? I mean, when you lifted the cup, did you have any idea, in part of what you'd achieved, but also how it was perceived at home?
No, we had very little feel, and no one could have, let's face it, because the country just stopped. People were being pulled out of bed to watch this thing, Princess Mary of Denmark, who will be the new Queen of Denmark, she told me that, her father pulled her out of bed at 4 a.m, to watch this strange thing happening, and it's all in that era. The race was nearly 4 hours long, not 40 minutes.
What about Alan Bond? After a decade of trying, what was his reaction?
Straight to Wall Street. Straight to Wall Street. He had every investment banker wanting to meet him and every Saudi Arabian prince wanting to lend him money. So he was flying.
His long-term plan worked.
Well,
for a while.
His dream of global trade was there. Yeah.
How life-changing was that day in September 1983 for John Bertrand?
Well, it got the it gave me a sense of contentment. I think that's possibly the biggest issue for me, the same thing, the drive, the competitive environment of people. Some people have more competitive drive than others. Well, and I tell people that, to be a world champion, you're not a normal person. You've got to be crazy in some manner to get out of bed to do extraordinary things. And I'm part of that sect, and Raza will say the same thing. And you would be the same, double Olympic gold medalist. You are different. You have to be different to have done what you've done. And similarly with with Dennis Conner and Buddy Melgers and these characters, they're different people. And for me, it was a sense of contentment, which I can't put a value to. And of course, in addition to that, it's allowed me to meet literally anyone in Australia and literally anyone in the world as a result of what I've done, and what our team have done as an organisation.
Looking at the influence the Cup has on sport now and its athletes, how big a momentum shift was that day in September 83 for our sport?
Yeah, so it changed the game, clearly. It changed the World of America's Cup. The 87, I think there were 13 challengers that competed the year before in the World Championship in Fremantle. So Michael Fay, who then funded, I think it was 3 New Zealand challenges, he said to me that he was watching on television and his conclusion is, if those bastards can win it, maybe we can do it. This is the Kiwi attitude. And the same situation where it gave people, it took it to another level in terms of perhaps we can do this if we really give it our best. And that's it. So it opened the game up within the World of America's Cup. And it gave a lot of stories for a lot of people, that's for sure.
For a man with such a very obvious love of our sport, who's been involved his whole life, you've also worked in other sports, experienced the way they operate. How has sailing progressed in your time, and what shape do you think the sport's in?
Well, the sport is, in terms of from a technical point of view and coaching point of view, it's just taken it to another level. The learning curve that I was on, and still am, is relatively, well, it's steep in terms of most people's view, because I'm a born student of life. I ask questions, I'm always learning. However, fully coached, the Kovalenko groups and these other people, it just takes it to another level of, the learning curve is much more steep. So the quality of racing, watching the Olympics, let's say, in Tokyo, the level of racing is sensational. And in Paris, it'll be higher again. And Los Angeles, it'll be just another level again. That's human endeavour. So I look back in my Finn days when I was Olympics, it was amateur hour relative to now. and the America's Cup, we're highly progressed. Ms. Kinsey said that we're on a new S-curve of development, both in all ways, both technical and also team building. But you look back, 40 years on now, and it's just another world. Recently we're up at, with Ben Ainsley at the Mercedes F1 headquarters where Ineos is, and it's just another world of computer power and whatever. It still gets back to human beings, but regardless. So the sport has progressed dramatically from a technical point of view and performance. Where are we at? Well, it's I think that we're at crossroads in many ways. I was with Thomas Bach, the president of the IOC, recently in Lausanne, and he was talking about the Olympics. That they've now got into the suburbs of cities, and hence rock climbing and skateboarding and these new sports being delivered. Perhaps the whole issue of online gaming will be an Olympic sport into the future. Long way to go with that, but putting all that aside. So the sport of sailing, if you talk about the Olympics and exposure of sailing within the Olympics, we've got to be careful that we remain relevant to the audience. And a lot of stuff is old world. We love it. There's no question about it. But we've got to be aware that, we're dealing now with young people with different aspirations. I think the concern of overcoaching is always of concern. Parents living through their children, it's a big one. And this issue of is watching the bubbles go past, such that, that you have this whole issue of passion, and for people to retain that passion of the sport, because it can be a life obsession, it can be a life journey. That's part of our challenge as a sport.
It's been an astonishing career in sport, John. What do you think the talented Thomas Pearce, your great-granddad, what would he have made of all of this?
Gee, I think he'd be proud, clearly, as one would expect, and his mind would boggle in terms of the technology and the level of human performance that can be pulled together within this sport of sailing. Because the thing that I love is this concept of what's the game going to look like in 20 years' time, and let's apply that to now. Let's get there faster than anyone else in the world, and that was the philosophy behind the Australia 2 program. We think we know what the status quo is at the moment. That's fine. All we do know is in 20 years' time, we'll be much further progressed. You look at the Olympiad, every 4 years, you get improvements. Every 20 years, a massive improvement, whether it's throwing a javelin, sailing a boat, 100 metres swim, much further progressed. So the question is, how do we get there faster than anyone else in the world? That was basically a philosophy behind the Australia 2 program. And this issue of bringing a team together to create this incredible sense of trust. That's an easy word to say, but it's hard to do. Real trust deep down, such that you can perform under any pressurized environment. That is only going to get more and more sophisticated over time, because that's human endeavour.
What would you have told that little lad building a boat with his brother and venturing out into the bay, about to embark on a lifetime of sailing adventures? John, what would you say to him now?
I think, life is a journey. This whole idea of higher, further and faster, that's of interest, but this whole issue of just loving the sport for what it is. I remember when I first went, we pulled the sail on and we couldn't believe it, that we're just going through the water. It blew me away, it still does.
John Bertrand, it's been an absolute honour. Thank you so much for your time and your memories. Thank you.
My pleasure.
A more eloquent summary of the love of our sport I could not possibly ask for, ladies and gentlemen. Decades spent at the very pinnacle of yacht racing, and John Bertrand still marvels at the joy of the wind in his sails. John, on behalf of all our listeners, a massive thank you for your time and for your energy and enthusiasm for the sport. Sailing is lucky to have you. Well, that's it for this month. But I don't mind telling you that next month we've got another massive name from the sport of sailing. One of the biggest names from the current crop of fast foiling sailboat skippers. A multiple world champion, an America's Cup winner, and one of the most sought after helms in the game. Coming up in a few weeks' time. Until then, if you're enjoying what you hear, buy us a coffee. It's easy to do. buymeacoffee.com/sailing podcast, helping us bring you these uninterrupted, ad-free chats from the leading lights in the sport of sailing. Before we go, a big thanks to Tim at Vertigo Films, whose tireless work and enthusiasm makes these podcasts possible. Tim, thanks again for all the hard work. Keep in touch via social media. I'm Shirley Sail on Instagram and Twitter, and Shirley Robertson on Facebook. And if you're so inclined, why not head over to the podcast YouTube channel to check out the series of films on my double-handed offshore season racing with Dika Farry. Well, that's all from us this month. Thank you so much for listening. Have fun on the water and sail safe, everyone.
This is Castle 1. Race officer speaking.
Lane line is on boundary up ahead, 35 seconds out.
A bit lower and faster here.
That's a good one, Jimmy.
Still gaining on the lane line there.
We're looking at 10.5 and 42. Matching him on the boundary, yeah. Copy.
This is Castle 1 standing by. Out.